Well, hello fellow pilots and welcome to another AirSim3D C560XL tutorial. And as always, glad to have the pleasure of your company today. Today I'm flying the British country-themed red ribbon livery, and I've chosen it as a contrast to the white snowy background below. We are flying over the great state of Colorado in the USA, headed for our home base in Seattle on the Pacific coast. Now, as we begin chapter 2 of this tutorial, and hopefully you have spent time looking at the tutorials in the first chapter, I'd like to begin this chapter by asking you a simple fundamental question. What is the most important system on any aircraft that flies high and fast? Think about that for a second. Well, if you said electronics, well, you'd be partly right. No doubt that would be bad. But this aircraft has a complete set of backup emergency instruments powered by the backup emergency battery, which will allow a pilot to continue to navigate to places, talk on comms with ATC, and so get safely back on the ground. Is it hydraulics? No. This jet has emergency gear, blowdown, and other safety feature backup procedures to be able to land without hydraulics. You'll come in fairly fast and hot because the flaps won't work, but it can be done. Engines. It's got to be engines, right? Well, engine fires and failures are really bad news, but the aircraft is fully capable of flying on any one engine for duration. Yes, you'll have to manage fuel imbalances and other rudder biases, things in the cockpit to compensate for having power only on one side, and landing will be tricky. But the aircraft is still very safe and flyable with one engine out. But what if you lose both engines? Well, yeah, that's possible, but in the real world, a two-engine flameout has never actually happened in this aircraft as far as I know, and its engines are very reliable. So, it's no to all of the above because, and as you can see, we are slowly blacking out. And so yes, ladies and gentlemen, the most important system if you are flying above 10,000 feet altitude is the one that allows you to virtually stay alive and be able to fly this aircraft. And the pressurization system in this jet ensures that that can happen. That's right. If you did not catch it, there was a clue in this tutorial's title. The most important system, and the reason we start our critical systems chapter to begin with, is the aircraft's pressurization system. Without it, you, the pilot, will virtually die. So today, we're going to learn how to operate that system to simply help you stay virtually alive. And if that's not a good reason for this tutorial, then I don't know what is. Okay, so here's the plan for today. We'll look at the pressurization modes available, and there are 3 of them. Next, during this high flight, we'll simulate depressurizing the aircraft to see what annunciations, warnings, procedures need to be followed, and to do that pretty darn quickly so as to not black out. But even if you do, how to regain consciousness if you are able to set up systems before you black out. This of course assumes that you have turned on the SIMS option to enable blackout simulations. So let's get started. Now, if you viewed our earlier tutorials, and we strongly encourage you to view them in their numbered order because each one builds on knowledge gained in previous ones, we have repeatedly advised against making assumptions about how this aircraft quote-unquote should work when compared to quote-unquote others that you may have had experience flying, only because each aircraft is different. I hope you'll agree with that. And to drive that point home, if you think you can set this pressurization system up as you have done in other jets by setting your intended flight level, I guarantee you will black out and then think there are bugs and get all frustrated and angry when in fact, plain and simple, sorry to say, pilot error will be that cause. So let's throw away those assumptions and preconceived notions about what to do to pressurize this aircraft based on your past experience. This is a 95% replica, and pilots need to learn how it operates, just like the real world. So, thank you for watching this video and our tutorial series, Good for You. As with all major systems in this highly replicated aircraft, this aircraft has its own fully custom 100% authentic pressurization system. So let's now dive into how the pressurization system works in this aircraft. First, it provides 3 modes. With this switch in auto, you will see an LA designator in the right window. The second mode, push this button to change any mode to flight level mode with its FL designator. And finally, my favorite mode, and one that gives the pilot full control, the manual mode with its CA designator. By the way, you cannot get to manual when you are in FL mode. Get out of FL mode first, then switch to manual. But you can get to FL mode directly from manual mode. And when you do that, the manual mode will automatically shut off. This EXR button on the side is only for ground crew when performing system checks on the ground, so it doesn't really serve any purpose when flying. So those are the 3 modes. Next, unlike other aircraft, there are no packs to turn on. This aircraft uses bleed air directly from the engines through a system of valves, obviously. It uses it directly for pressurization as soon as the engines are up and running, and therefore requires at least one engine to be running and throttled to have N1 greater than 45%. So, if you are on one engine above 10,000 feet and gliding to lower altitudes, maintain an N1 of greater than 45% as a safety precaution, or you will begin to lose aircraft pressurization and, of course, begin to black out. Third and finally, we have set alt, target, and rate windows. So that's set altitude, target, and rate windows. And this little dial to tune the instrument, and we'll get to that in a minute. But before we get there, there are 3 super critical important things to remember about the C560XL's pressurization system overall. Number 1, in auto mode, you set your LA or landing field altitude, and then the system does the rest. You do not, and this is the important part, you do not set the external highest flight level that you will be flying as you may be used to doing in other aircraft. Also in auto mode, you do not need to dump pressure after landing because the system will equalize everything for you automatically. As you can imagine, the auto mode is the easiest mode to use. Second, in FL or flight level mode, you will set the desired internal cockpit and cabin altitude level pressure. And again, it is not the external highest flying level that you will be flying, but in this mode, you will need to then manually set the internal pressure to match your landing field altitude once you are on final approach and well below 10,000 AGL, or if you do not manage that descent profile pressurization to land at 0 pressure differential, then you will need to manually dump pressure to equalize it at some point after you have landed. But that is bad piloting. Dumping differential pressure on the ground basically means that you are blowing out your passengers' eardrums. And then I hope your company fires you for doing that. So please, fly this realistic jet realistically. Third, in manual CA or cabin altitude mode, you guessed it, you control everything manually by setting internal flight levels and watching for potential dangerous pressure differentials. And speaking about pressure differentials, what's that? Well, remember that in flight and depending on your current altitude, there will always be some level of pressure difference between the inside and outside of the fuselage, and this little needle along with the inner rows of numbers in the gauge displays the amount of pressure difference between the inside and the outside of the fuselage. Now in auto mode, the aircraft will manage differences. But if you are flying FL or CA modes, then monitor that little needle carefully and make sure your differential never redlines. So how do you do that? Well, in those modes, you will change the set alt or the altitude setting number using the dial to help move the needle away from the red line. And how should the instrument be set up to ensure that does not happen? Now, and this part is critical, so take your time to understand this, please. To bring the differential lower from the red line, pilots need to set higher alt internal flight levels. So the set alt number will need to be larger than it is currently set to. Now this can get confusing at first, but if you think about it, increasing the set alt number reduces the internal fuselage pressure. So it's like you're experiencing a higher flight level, and higher altitudes have less air density, and less air density means less pressure. And so by increasing the internal fuselage altitude, you are in fact reducing the difference between the internal and external pressure, and then the needle will begin to track downward. But be careful. You should never set the alt target to anything more than 10,000 feet, or guess what? You'll be flying at above 10,000 feet internal flight level altitude, and blackout will inevitably ensure. So it's a balancing act. Anyway, practice changing internal flight altitudes and observe the effects. I promise it'll make sense once you've tried it. So that's about the smaller of the two needles. Now the larger one, on the other hand, shows the current internal cabin pressure or the internal flight level. And if that ever reads above 10 on the gauge, signifying 10,000 indicated, 10,000 altitude indicated, that will trigger the red cab alt cabin altitude annunciator up top. And if you recall from our earlier annunciator tutorial, red you're dead, so it will require your immediate attention. You always want to see that needle below 10, signifying that the cabin is flying below 10,000 feet indicated. Now, if you see a cab alt red alert and have at least one engine running to provide bleed air for pressurization, then go into crisis solving mode immediately, and to solve, you first need to rapidly assess what's wrong. Well, there are a number of possibilities. Hopefully, it's a slow door leak that's crept up on you, and you should see the door seal annunciator up front, obviously unless it's working. Maybe it's not. So in that case, make sure the autopilot is on, you're flying straight and level, then get up and go lock the door correctly. And you can find those instructions in our earlier exit and panel tutorials. The second possibility is that someone bumped the red emergency dump switch to on. Now in this case, you will see its annunciation up top and a rapidly increasing positive number in the rate window. So how do you fix that? Well, turn the switch to off as quickly as possible. Now, if there are no other problems, the pressure will build and all should be well. But if the internal pressure indicated by the big hand is showing anything over 13 or 14,000 feet, then also turn the pressure source dial to emergency also. Now, if you've lost one engine, which in of itself is not enough to trigger cab alt warnings, and if you're gliding down with your N1 below 50%, then you will not have enough power to provide bleed air, so throttle up to about 50% N1 to get enough bleed air from the working engine for pressurization. But in all cases, your immediate reaction should be, first and most importantly, make sure the emergency dump switch is off. And then, if necessary, turn the pressurization source dial to the emergency position to help build back pressure quickly. Even if the difference gets too bad and you black out, then if the dump switch is off and the engines are running, the system will repressurize the aircraft and you will slowly wake up again even when you're at a higher altitude. Once awake, plan to land as soon as possible. However, if we take the most extreme example and we've now lost both engines, then things are more dire since the bleed air source for pressurization is no longer available. In that case, you have two options. Both unfortunately not very good, but here they are. First, recognize that you do not have much time before blacking out, and nothing you do in the short term will prevent that. So first, confirm the emergency dump switch is off. That's always your go-to first task. Now there are two scenarios. If you are below 25,000 feet, turn the autopilot off if it's on. Now look for an emergency landing spot. Declare an emergency to ATC, and at the same time quickly push forward and initiate a rapid emergency descent. You want to get to below 10,000 as quickly as possible. And in a two engine out situation, don't bother with speed brakes. They won't be functional anyway since hydraulics are shot and the brakes blow back to their stored position anyway. Below 10,000 feet, and hopefully you did that fast enough so you did not black out. Continue to maintain airspeed over 180 knots as you glide down. Initiate a gear blowdown about 500 feet AGL and try to land with as low an airspeed as possible. Remember, you will have no flaps and no engine reversers or wheel brakes either. Now the second scenario with both engines out at high altitude is that you probably won't make the dive to below 10,000 feet first without blacking out, and then waking up below 10,000 feet at the rate of descent you initiated before you started the dive. So you're basically going to lawn dart into the ground. Sorry, hope your will was up to date. But unless you cheat and go outside camera view and watch your descent. There's a little sim trick for you. But seriously, from high altitude, if you do not want the I'm probably going to be a lawn dart scenario, and to give yourself a fighting chance, there's another option, and that is to quickly check the emergency dump switches off, dial the AP's alt target setting to below 5,000 feet, turn Alt off if you have it on, and hit the FLC function. What this will do is make the aircraft level change to the altitude you dialed in, and you'll probably black out during that transition time. But then as it passes through 10,000 feet and before getting to 5,000 feet for the level off, to try to maintain 5,000 feet as long as it can, then hopefully somewhere between 10,000 and 5,000 you'll wake up with the aircraft still gliding downwards. When you wake up, as soon as you can, turn the AP off no matter what altitude you are at. Get control of the aircraft, find a landing spot, then do the usual. Blow the gear down and then try to land. Good luck. And again, remember, you will have no flaps and no reversals or brakes either. And be careful in both these scenarios if you are using the realistic panel mode, because you will buckle the gear and cause fires maybe if you come down too hard. And in all cases, airspeed management is critical when gliding, when you're in a gliding scenario. 100. So those are the pressurization modes and the emergency pressurization and descent procedures. And to summarize so far, there are three modes. And for emergencies, first, make sure the dump switch is not open, that it's off. The pressurization source to emergency if engine bleed air is available. Get below 10,000 feet quickly to try to stay awake. And of course, land as soon as possible. So now, let's change gears a bit and see how to set up pressurization correctly for a normal flight. By the way, all three modes begin their pressurization cycles only after the aircraft is airborne and then all the way to landing. But anyway, first let's set up pressure for an automatically managed flight pressurization profile. As you may have noticed in this tutorial, we were flying to Seattle and its landing field altitude was set to 0, that is sea level. But now you'll notice the jet turning around and we're heading back to Denver. Well, That's just because we heard one of the passengers is not feeling that well, so I guess the clam chowder at Seattle will have to wait for another day. So in an in-flight change needed situation, or when starting on the ground in auto mode, you'd set the landing field altitude, and in our case it's Denver Airport's altitude, of 5,434 feet. Now about this dial and target window layout, very important. The far right small zeros are 100s and cannot be set. They will always read 00. So as an example, this is a targeted landing altitude of 100 feet, not 1.00 feet. The first number in the main window is 100s, the second thousands, and the third, you guessed it, is 10,000s. Yep, this aircraft is capable of managing pressure profiles to fly into very high and very low airport altitudes. There's actually one in the Dead Sea area that's below sea level, and one in Bolivia that is at 13,000 feet altitude. Try flying into those, and it's fun to watch the pressurization work its magic. In our example, however, our more modest landing altitude needs to be set to 5,434 feet, which is Denver. So I'll set that to 55, signifying 5,500. That's the altitude pressure we are going to set to use to land at our final destination in Colorado. But wait, why 55 and not 54? Well, here's a pro tip. It's a real-world good practice to always set the inbound destination landing altitude to be 100 feet higher or greater than the landing field altitude. That way, the aircraft is bound to land with zero differential because you land 100 feet lower than the higher altitude that you've set. So once it's set, the aircraft will manage pressure automatically down to the landing field to arrive safely at zero differential. Next, in the FL mode, the windows read the same, although remember you are now setting the desired altitude for your internal cockpit and cabin. The aircraft will have no concept of your landing altitude, so therefore you will need to manage the step up and down to zero landing differential by monitoring the differential indicator. And as you will recall, we talked earlier in this tutorial about how and where to manually manage the differential. But now, since we are setting internal flight levels for the aircraft, it's equally critically important to remember what we just talked about when setting and interpreting the set alt window numbers. So here's an example of what can happen if you don't pay attention to your FL mode internal altitude correctly. Suppose you're planning to take off for a flight level of 320, and so you set the large set alt numbers in FL or CA mode to read 600, thinking, I'll fly at 6,000 feet internal altitude pressure, nice and comfortable for my passengers. So bad news here, they're all going to pass out with the setting that you just set as you sail past 10,000 feet altitude. But wait, why? It's set for a safe internal altitude of 6,000 feet. Well, no, because what you've done is to set the internal pressure altitude to 60,000 feet, not 6,000 feet. Therefore, the aircraft will not begin to pressurize until it gets to 60,000 feet, which it never will because that's beyond its design limit. So again, it's critical not to forget the two little 100 zeros in the set alt window. If you want to set 6,000 feet, that should be set as 060, 060. Setting the right field altitude or internal flight level is absolutely critical for your digital health when using either of the three modes. And again, when flying FL or CA modes, watch the pressure differential needle to ensure that you are not also overstressing the aircraft.
Now you know the rest of the story.
Thank you for that, Mr. Harvey. And so there you have it, folks. The C560XL pressurization system with its three modes, all there to enable you and your passengers to fly high and fast and comfortably and safely. And remember the small zeros. Happy flying. Good day.